30 years with the CIA, 1964 to 1994.
I worked for the government for 35 years, starting with the Marine Corps from 1964 to 1968 with some service in Vietnam.
I was 25 years as a professional intelligence officer with CIA.
Almost 5 years in the Pentagon, and the last almost 3 of that working in the Office of Secretary of Defense.
Spent almost 20 years with the State Department, 3 years in Athens as a political counselor, the chief of the political section.
I'm a retired colonel of the United States Army, military intelligence, special forces.
I was previously with the State Department's Office of Counterterrorism from 1989 to 1993. Prior to that, I worked with the Central Intelligence Agency.
I'm a former senior estimates officer with the Central Intelligence Agency.
I started actually as a science fellow at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency and became the chief scientist of the Arms Control Agency.
For 27 years was an analyst first of Soviet affairs and then of wider responsibilities.
I'm a congressman representing the 30th District in Los Angeles.
I've just completed almost 3 decades of service to the United States.
Most recently, I was an Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon from 1994 to 2001.
I served for 23 years in the American Foreign Service as a diplomat.
I worked for the CIA for 28 and a half years.
I joined the agency in 1988, originally with what was then known as the National Photographic Interpretation Center.
Yeah, I'm Washington editor of the Nation magazine. I've been doing that for about 16 years now.
I'm the Labour MP for a constituency in Birmingham called Birmingham Ladywood. I've been the MP for 20 years.
For 30 years I was a diplomat serving my country abroad. My last position, however, was as ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War.
July of 1970, the President asked me to come over to be White House counsel. And I served for roughly 1,000 days until it all fell apart.
23 years as a commissioned officer in the United States Army. I came back to public service in 2001 to be the Secretary of the Army.
Spent 21 years in the CIA. Of that time, I spent 90% in the Middle East.
I'm a former weapons inspector with the United Nations in Iraq. I served in that capacity from 1991 to 1998.
I worked for the CIA for 20 years, from 1966 to 1986.
I've worked on assessing secret nuclear weapons programs for almost 20 years.
Never expected that I'd leave the Navy and become the chief spook of our country, the director of Central Intelligence, but that happened.
Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction.
Iraq's weapons of mass destruction.
A clear threat to the United States.
There's dozens of ballistic missiles.
It has sponsored and sheltered terrorists.
Paying suicide
Chemical
bombers.
weapons are equally chilling.
Biological weapons, including anthrax and botulism toxin.
Biological and chemical agent to kill millions of people.
Chemical weapons, including VX and sarin, mustard gas.
To a massive and sudden horror.
Massive death and destruction. Death on a massive scale.
The danger to our country is grave. The danger to our country is growing. The Iraqi regime possesses biological and chemical weapons. The Iraqi regime is building the facilities necessary to make more biological and chemical weapons. And according to the British government, the Iraqi regime could launch a biological or chemical attack in as little as 45 minutes after the order were given. The regime has long-standing and continuing ties to terrorist organizations, and there are al-Qaeda terrorists inside Iraq. The regime is seeking a nuclear bomb, and with fissile material could build one within a year.
The Bush administration made up its mind to go to war on September the 11th, 2001.
That very first day, on September 12th, one day after September 11, the meeting that was held in the White House, in the Situation Room, led to Rumsfeld asking the question, shouldn't we use this as an opportunity to do something about Iraq as well?
We all said, but no. Al-Qaeda is in Afghanistan. We need to bomb Afghanistan. And Rumsfeld said, there aren't any good targets in Afghanistan. And there are lots of good targets in Iraq.
From that time on, you were dealing with rationalization and justification for the war. You weren't dealing with real causes for the war or real reasons for the war. There was never a clear and present danger. There was never an imminent threat.
With weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass death.
Weapons of mass destruction was a convenient way of tricking our Congress into giving the president authority to wage this war.
Saddam has resumed his efforts to acquire nuclear weapons.
Develop nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons.
It was clear that Iraq did not have a nuclear weapons program. But over and over again, President Bush, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, particularly Vice President Cheney, but also National Security Advisor Condi Rice, drummed up the idea of a reconstituted nuclear capability, and particularly the notion that I think has some resonance among the American people of the mushroom cloud.
Leaders will use worst-case assessments that point to nuclear weapons to generate political support because they know people fear nuclear weapons so much.
The evidence was simply not there. Wolfowitz would be asked to explain, how good is the evidence? Can you tell us more about it? This is in NATO, mind you. And he'd say, well, it's like this. It's like pornography. Hard to describe, but you recognize it when you see it. My God. And we're going to go to war on that?
If someone is waiting for a so-called smoking gun, it's certain that we will have waited too long.
We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun, that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
So a lot of people who supported the war in Iraq actually believed that Iraq had the capability to fire missiles that could reach the United States, carrying payloads of nuclear or chemical or biological weapons. Iraq has never had the capability to do that. They didn't have it in the first Gulf War. They didn't have it in this war in Iraq. And they don't have it in any way of getting it in the future.
What the Bush administration did was try to round up as many people as they could who would make the case for them.
What the White House wanted was the CIA to give it talking points to justify this war. It already made up its mind.
Massive intervention by people, particularly from Vice President Cheney's office and Vice President Cheney himself in the process.
And I think the intelligence analysts found themselves really up against it when they tried to argue that those connections weren't as tight as people were saying.
The intelligence director of the Department of Energy simply ordered his experts who had raised questions about the evidence being used on the nuclear end of it to, as the news accounts say, to sit down and shut up so that the DOE would be on board with the overall estimate.
They were not given an opportunity to speak because no one wanted to hear what they said.
I was in chief of collecting information on Iraq through the mid-90s. I know what we had and what we didn't have, and I'm here to tell you there was no information.
I understand that the director himself, George Tenet, is now accompanying the briefer in the morning, and this never happened in the past. In the past, we were trusted, we were senior people, we knew what the score was. And when I hear that George Tenet is going down with the senior briefer, I wonder why.
And the very heavy leaning on the Director of Central Intelligence and his staff to produce precisely the language which would allow them to make the statements which they have been making to support the decision to go into Iraq.
Well, not only by their physical presence, but by the questions they asked, by the, well, don't you think, sort of things. Well, couldn't it be possible that?
They call this data mining, going back over old information, coming with new conclusions.
And the overwhelming opinion from the scientists of this government at the Department of Energy and even at the CIA and some of the State Department were arguing against using weapons of mass destruction as a case to go to war.
You're talking about the Vice President of the United States, and you're talking about a GS 13 or 14, a mid-level analyst in the Central Intelligence Agency. You're talking about a person who should have career protection for telling it like it is, but who knows that his chief, the director of CIA, is a member of the team, A lot of pressure on that. Shouldn't happen.
The whole purpose of the CIA was to leave those people out of Langley. That's why they're not in Washington, they're in Northern Virginia, away from the White House, away from Congress. Leave them alone, ask them what they think, but don't tell them to rethink their positions. because then you come up with nonsense.